What happens to an idea when it is judged too powerful to be shared? Imagine a single sheet of paper sliding into a government file drawer, ink still fresh, diagrams careful and hopeful, a human mind distilled into lines and measurements. Then the drawer closes, a stamp falls, classified, and the world never hears about it again. This story begins not with a single inventor, but with a pattern. Again and again, across decades and disciplines, certain ideas reach a threshold where curiosity collides with caution. Energy systems that promise abundance. Devices that bend familiar rules. Concepts that, if real, would quietly rearrange how we live. At that edge, something happens. Silence. In the United States and several other countries, a legal mechanism exists that allows governments to restrict inventions deemed sensitive to national security. The intent is understandable. Some knowledge can be weaponized. Some discoveries arrive before society is ready to handle them. The challenge lies in the gray space between protection and erasure. For most inventors, a patent is a doorway, a chance to explain, to protect, to contribute, but for a small and obscure group, the act of filing becomes a turning point. Instead of publication, they receive a notice. They are told not to speak, not to build, not to share, sometimes not even to keep their own notes. Years pass, lifetimes pass. The silence remains. What makes these cases unsettling is not that every claim was true. Many likely were not. Science is full of dead ends, self-deception, and sincere mistakes. What lingers is a quieter question. If an idea does not work, why hide it? If a device is impossible, why forbid discussion of its details? This documentary journey is not about proving forbidden machines or exposing secret plots. It is about human limits, about how institutions respond to uncertainty, about the tension between open inquiry and collective fear. Each chapter explores a different moment when an invention crossed an invisible line, entering a space where explanation stopped and control began. We will hear of chemists, engineers, physicists, and tinkerers. Some were respected, some were marginal. Some died believing they had touched something profound. Others lived long enough to doubt themselves. Their stories are fragmented, filtered through redactions, legal language, and memory. They survive as outlines, like constellations missing their brightest stars. Along the way, we will ask careful questions. Not, was this true, but why did it matter? Not, who was right, but what was lost when conversation ended. The goal is not to accuse, but to understand the cost of secrecy, both justified and excessive. Because secrecy has a shape. It bends time. It turns discoveries into rumors, and rumors into myths. It invites imagination to fill gaps left by absence. And over decades, it transforms ordinary human striving into something almost legendary. At its heart, this is a story about trust. Trust in institutions to decide wisely. Trust in society to adapt. Trust in the slow, self-correcting nature of science. When that trust breaks, silence rushes in to take its place. As we begin, hold one thought gently. Somewhere between what we know and what we fear lies a fragile space where progress happens. What we choose to lock away from that space may define not only our technologies, but our future understanding of ourselves. The drawer is closing now. Let's look inside before it does. It began Not in a government lab or a defense contractor's office, but in a small, ordinary laboratory at the University of Utah. March 1989. Chemists Martin Fleischmann and Stanley Ponce stood before a press conference, their hands shaking slightly as they announced something extraordinary. They had achieved nuclear fusion at room temperature, no massive particle accelerators, no blinding lasers, just a tabletop electrochemical cell quietly releasing what they claimed was fusion energy. The implications were staggering. Clean, limitless power. A potential end to fossil fuel dependency. The holy grail of energy science, from a device no bigger than a coffee pot. But wonder quickly gave way to skepticism. Physicists around the world scrambled to replicate the results. Most failed. Some accused the pair of flawed measurements or wishful thinking. Within weeks, cold fusion became a punchline in scientific circles. The term itself fell under suspicion, a symbol of overpromised science. And yet, behind the scenes, something strange happened. In July 1989, just months after the announcement, the US government issued a secrecy order on Ponce and Fleischmann's patent application. The stated reason? National security. Suddenly, parts of the invention were no longer open to scrutiny. The researchers were forbidden to publish or even discuss certain technical aspects of their setup. Violating the order could mean prosecution. What exactly had they built? If cold fusion was a failed experiment, why classify it? Why silence two academic chemists as if they'd stumbled onto a weapon? Some believe they had, in a way, not a bomb, but a principle. A subtle, delicate configuration of isotopes, voltages, and chemical environments that, under rare and specific conditions, might tip matter into releasing nuclear energy without the destructive force. A quiet reaction, hard to reproduce, but real. Dangerous not because of its heat, but because of its accessibility. The portions of their patent that were eventually declassified describe a basic electrochemical cell, but the redacted sections, still hidden decades later, deal with electrical input parameters and isotopic compositions. These are the details researchers believe could hold the key to making the reactions stable, to making cold fusion real. Inside government laboratories, some say those secrets are being tested. Whispers persist of classified projects, Department of Energy clearances, experiments achieving quiet, controlled results. But outside, in the light of peer review, the field remains taboo. Fleischmann died in 2012. Ponce left academia, now living in France, his name a footnote in textbooks, either a visionary or a cautionary tale, depending on who you ask. Their original patents remain partially classified, 35 years after filing. The story of cold fusion isn't just about whether the reaction works. It's about what happens when scientific curiosity touches the edge of something powerful and perhaps too democratized for comfort. It's about the way secrecy can stall an idea, not because it's false, but because it's possible. What if fusion, the power of stars, can be coaxed into happening with simple tools in a quiet room? What if the hardest part isn't the science, but who gets to control it? January 1943. Nikola Tesla is found dead in his New York hotel room, a "Do Not Disturb" sign hanging quietly on the door. He was 86, alone, forgotten by the mainstream science world, yet revered by pockets of admirers who believed he had touched truths the world wasn't ready to receive. Hours later, FBI agents arrive. They move swiftly, collecting his papers, notebooks, and boxes of diagrams. Officially, it was a precaution, ensuring enemy powers couldn't access sensitive wartime knowledge. But among the confiscated documents, something stood out. Several patent applications Tesla had filed in the 1930s, never published, never approved, described a strange evolution of one of his lesser-known ideas: the bladeless turbine. The basic version of the Tesla turbine was public, a series of smooth, closely spaced discs spinning fluid between them, using viscosity instead of blades to generate motion. Elegant, but ultimately inefficient by conventional standards. It was admired for its creativity, not its utility, but Tesla claimed to have improved the design significantly, enough to achieve energy outputs greater than what was input. Over unity. That term alone, over unity, rings alarm bells. It implies perpetual motion, a violation of the laws of thermodynamics. Science, as we know it, says such a thing is impossible. And so, many dismissed Tesla's late-life claims as the eccentricity of a once great mind slipping into fantasy. Yet the documents were never returned. Decades passed. Tesla's family fought to reclaim his estate. In 1952, his nephew formally petitioned the U.S. government for the release of the inventor's remaining papers. The FBI responded. Some documents, they admitted, were still classified under national security orders. Among them, the improved turbine designs. Why? Some believe Tesla had discovered a method to harness ambient energy, extracting usable power from environmental temperature differentials, or even from the quantum vacuum. Others speculate that while the turbine itself didn't produce over unity, it hinted at physical principles applicable to classified technologies, perhaps in fluid dynamics, propulsion, or reactor design. In 2000, a portion of Tesla's confiscated papers was declassified, but the improved turbine documents were absent. Repeated attempts to obtain them through the Freedom of Information Act were denied. The reason remained unchanged: national security. Over 80 years after Tesla's death, whatever he may have discovered remains locked away. Tesla's legacy today straddles two worlds. In one, he is the father of alternating current, the genius who lit the modern world. In the other, he is a prophet of lost energy technologies, a man whose final insights were too disruptive to be allowed into the open. Perhaps both are true. The bladeless turbine was never commercialized. In public, it remained an elegant curiosity, but somewhere behind the veil of classification, its modified form might have lived on, not as a machine that defies physics, but as a door to physics we still don't fully understand. What happens when a brilliant mind leaves behind puzzles no one is allowed to solve? What if the real limitation isn't the laws of nature, but the laws we write to protect them? 1950. In a modest office in California, a physicist named William Line drafts the blueprints for something unthinkable, a propulsion system that defies Newton's third law. His device, he claimed, could generate thrust without expelling any mass. No rocket fuel, no jets, just an arrangement of electrodes and high-voltage pulses creating movement by manipulating electrostatic pressure. A craft, theoretically, could push against space itself. It sounded impossible. It sounded like magic. But Liner believed in it enough to file for a patent. He never got the chance to see it examined. The moment his application reached the U.S. Patent Office, it was intercepted. A secrecy order was issued. His invention was classified, immediately, permanently, without ever being tested for feasibility. From that moment on, Line entered a kind of exile, legally gagged, forbidden from building, discussing, or publishing the details of his work. The government made its position clear. Any violation would carry criminal penalties. For decades, he lived under this silence. In later years, Liner wrote carefully worded books about his experience, staying just outside the lines drawn by the order. He described the principle in general terms: electrostatic fields, asymmetric pressure gradients, the suggestion of movement without reaction mass. But he never revealed the critical details: the geometry of the electrodes, the pulse sequences, the timing. Those, he said, were the heart of the device, and the part he was forbidden to share. Why such secrecy? Officially, the concern was national defense. A propulsion system needing no fuel, no exhaust, no moving parts, such a device would revolutionize everything from satellites to submarines. It could allow silent, maneuverable craft that operated beyond the bounds of conventional physics, or more likely, beyond the bounds of conventional detection. Skeptics dismissed Line's claims. The laws of physics were clear, they argued. Conservation of momentum couldn't be violated. No mass expelled, no motion. End of story. But reality, as always, proved more complex. In the decades since, researchers experimenting with similar electrostatic and electromagnetic concepts have observed something odd. Small thrusts, anomalous movements, too weak to be useful, too consistent to ignore. Even NASA tested one such device, the controversial EM drive. It, too, generated thrust without propellant. The results were murky. The implications, enormous. Did Liner stumble upon the same principle decades earlier? His patent remains sealed. His name rarely surfaces in official histories. And yet, his story echoes through countless experimental labs where scientists still chase the dream of reactionless propulsion. William Line died in 2021. He spent 71 years under a secrecy order that never lifted. A lifetime of invention, locked away by the very country he sought to serve. Maybe his device didn't work. Maybe it did. Maybe the geometry was flawed, or the voltages never reached the needed threshold. But the more haunting possibility is this: what if it did work? And what if the silence around it wasn't to protect us from fantasy, but from freedom? When technology can break the limits of motion, who decides how far it's allowed to go? The 1970s. A soft-spoken inventor named Yul Brown stands beside a flickering torch. What emerges from the nozzle isn't ordinary fire. It burns clean, quiet. It melts through tungsten like butter, yet can be safely passed over skin. He calls it Brown's gas. Generated from water through a unique form of electrolysis, the gas is a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen. Nothing new in itself. But Brown insists his process changes the properties of the gas, that his technique produces a new, stable molecular structure, something more than the sum of its parts. The scientific community doesn't know what to make of it. Some see a curious anomaly. Others see a fraud. But Brown files for patents in multiple countries, undeterred. In the United States, something unexpected happens. In 1977, Brown receives a secrecy order. His U.S. patent application is seized. He's informed that certain aspects of his electrolysis method are now classified. Specifically, the electrical parameters, voltage patterns, current modulation, frequency inputs. The part he claims gives the gas its unusual qualities. From that point on, he cannot legally disclose those details. Not in writing, not in speech, not even in private. So he leaves. Brown relocates to Australia, where he successfully patents versions of his device, with the sensitive parameters removed. He forms a company, sells small-scale generators. Some researchers experiment with the gas. A few report astonishing results. Metals fused at room temperature, altered combustion characteristics, energy outputs that don't match inputs. Others find nothing unusual. The truth stays elusive. Then, strange things begin to happen. One researcher has his equipment confiscated. Another receives a visit from U.S. Department of Energy officials advising him to stop his analysis. No reasons are given, just silence, dressed in authority. In 1998, the secrecy order on Brown's patent is partially lifted. Portions of the cell design are released, but the heart of the system, the waveforms, the timing, the frequencies remain blacked out. The parts Brown said mattered most. That same year, he dies. No fanfare, no vindication. Today, Brown's gas occupies a strange space in the energy world. It's real, replicable to a point. You can make it, you can use it. But its deeper claims about molecular resonance, metastable water, and hidden thermodynamics remain contested and largely unexplored. Perhaps Brown was wrong. Perhaps his results were the byproduct of measurement error or misunderstood chemistry. But if so, why classify? Why suppress a method that, by conventional understanding, should do nothing beyond standard electrolysis? The lingering suspicion is that Brown touched on something subtle, a narrow window of conditions where water behaves differently, where energy transfer follows rules we haven't fully written yet. Science requires replication, but suppression prevents it. So the questions remain. What if energy isn't just about fuel, but about rhythm? What if we've been listening to the wrong frequencies all along? 1967. In a quiet lab nestled within ITT Corporation, an aging genius returns to a dream he never quite let go of. Philo Farnsworth, the inventor who brought electronic television to life, now sets his sights on something more elusive: fusion energy. His device, the fuser, uses electric fields to accelerate ions toward a central point, where they collide and release energy. The concept is elegant and compact, unlike the sprawling billion-dollar fusion projects backed by governments. And the fuser works, at least in principle. It creates fusion reactions, but it consumes far more power than it produces. A neutron generator, not a power source. Still, Farnsworth believes he's found a way to tip the balance. He files new patent applications. These describe crucial modifications, subtle changes in geometry, voltage application, and containment fields. His hope: to create a stable, self-sustaining plasma that would produce net energy, fusion's holy grail. For a moment, the dream seems within reach. Then, silence. The US government steps in. The patent applications are seized and classified. Farnsworth is told he may not speak about the modifications. He may not build the improved device. If he refuses, funding will vanish. His company will collapse. He refuses. Farnsworth, a man who once brought moving images into American homes, now finds himself cut off from the very invention he hoped would power them. Funding dries up. His lab closes. His health declines. He dies in 1971, bitter and exhausted, carrying secrets he was never allowed to share. According to his widow Elma, who spoke out shortly before her own passing in 2006, Farnsworth had achieved brief periods of net energy production. She claimed the modified fuser maintained a self-sustaining plasma with minimal input. It wasn't perpetual motion, it was controlled fusion in a tabletop machine. The kind of device that, if real, could revolutionize everything. Years later, defense contractors quietly pursue similar ideas. Lockheed Martin announces work on a compact fusion reactor that fits on a truck, eerily similar in description to Farnsworth's lost design. The program soon goes dark, likely swallowed into classification. Hobbyists still build public versions of the fuser. It's a rite of passage for some young physicists. But without the missing pieces, they only ever reach the same limit: fusion without power, a promising spark without a flame. What did Farnsworth see? What did his modifications do? Did he solve a problem too large or too disruptive to be trusted in civilian hands? There is a strange comfort in assuming failed inventions are forgotten for good reason. But when secrecy enters the picture, failure is no longer the only explanation. Perhaps his device truly worked. Perhaps it didn't. But perhaps, just perhaps, he opened a door that others chose to close. And once again, we're left asking, what if the future arrived early and we turned it away? 1980s, Vancouver, Canada. A cluttered apartment hums with energy. Coils buzz, capacitors crackle, and strange, metallic objects hang suspended in midair. At the center of it all stands John Hutchison, a self-taught tinkerer who claims to have stumbled upon something impossible. He calls it the Hutchison effect. Under the influence of overlapping electromagnetic fields, high-voltage Tesla coils, radio frequency generators, and Van de Graaff machines, objects levitate, metals fuse without heat, wood and metal merge like melted wax. In some cases, materials reportedly become transparent. Hutchison films the phenomena. He applies for patents. Then, the silence arrives. Both the US and Canadian governments seize his applications. The inventions are classified under national security provisions. His equipment is examined. Parts are taken. He's warned, don't replicate the setup, don't share the configurations, don't speak of what you saw. The scientific community responds with skepticism. The videos, they say, are inconclusive. The effects can't be reliably reproduced. Critics accuse Hutchison of trickery or, at best, of misinterpreting coincidences. Without replication, there is no proof. And yet, why the seizure? Why the classification? If his experiments were fraudulent, why did military officials repeatedly visit his lab? Why did they document everything and remove critical components? Hutchison himself doesn't claim to understand the full mechanism. He suggests that the effect only occurs under a chaotic confluence of factors: the right frequencies, voltages, magnetic alignments, and spatial arrangements. A storm in a bottle, reliable only in its unpredictability. Some speculate that the true value of his setup wasn't the effects themselves, but the unintentional side phenomena: anomalous electromagnetic interactions, field-induced material changes, or unknown resonance patterns. In a world of classified research, such hints are enough to justify control. Over time, Hutchison learns to tread carefully. He still conducts public demonstrations, but he avoids revealing the specific configurations that once triggered the clampdown. He knows the line and walks just beside it. Meanwhile, behind closed doors, whispers persist. That DARPA and military labs have studied similar setups. That electromagnetic effects on materials, long dismissed in public, are being explored quietly for purposes ranging from propulsion to structural manipulation. Files remain classified. Programs remain unnamed. The Hutchison effect, whether misunderstood anomaly or misunderstood genius, continues to sit in limbo. Not quite disproven, not quite accepted. Like many things at the edge of science, it thrives in uncertainty. But maybe the question isn't whether John Hutchison discovered anti-gravity or molecular transmutation. Maybe the real mystery lies in what his chaos uncovered: a hidden sensitivity in the physical world, one we're not yet prepared to explore openly. And maybe, just maybe, the most dangerous inventions aren't the ones we understand too well, but the ones we barely understand at all. What happens when curiosity itself becomes a national threat? And who decides which chaos is allowed to become knowledge? Salt Lake City, 1931. A quiet, bespectacled engineer named T. Henry Moray stands before a stunned crowd. With no wires, no fuel, no visible power source, he lights bulbs, powers radios, runs heaters, all from a strange-looking device sitting on a wooden table. He calls it a radiant energy receiver. Moray claims it draws electricity from the ambient environment, perhaps cosmic rays, perhaps something deeper and unknown, not solar, not electromagnetic in the traditional sense, something subtler. The power flows at kilowatt levels, enough to heat a room or light a home. Consistently, cleanly. He files a patent. He is denied. Again and again, Moray's applications are rejected, not for lack of documentation, but for the nature of the claim. Perpetual motion, they call it. Impossible by definition. But FOIA-released documents, decades later, tell a different story. Patent officials were alarmed. Not dismissive, but worried. They referred Moray's work to military agencies, concerned that if real, it could destabilize energy systems, economic models, and global control. Then things turn darker. Moray's lab is broken into. His prototype, the one that powered homes without a drop of fuel, is destroyed. Equipment disappears. He's visited repeatedly by government officials demanding access. Threats follow. And after the passage of the Inventions Secrecy Act in 1951, his refiled patent applications are promptly classified. He spends the rest of his life battling the order. He never rebuilds the original device. He never shares the full plans. The technology dies with him in 1974. What remains is scattered. Fragments in old notebooks, cryptic descriptions in interviews, and the memories of those who watched light pour from a machine with no visible source. Skeptics say it was illusion, sleight of hand, a misunderstood battery, a forgotten wire, but those who saw it swear otherwise. And then there's the classification itself. If the device was a fraud, why seize it? Why keep it hidden? One theory is that Moray's detection tubes, unique vacuum-like components he designed, tapped into a form of energy not yet fully understood. Zero-point energy, a sea of potential beneath the vacuum itself, not perpetual motion, but a deeper layer of the physical world, uncharted and immensely powerful. Attempts to replicate Moray's work have largely failed. Without the original tubes, now lost, it remains a puzzle with missing pieces. And perhaps that's by design. Some believe military labs attempted to recreate his device, that projects exist buried in black budgets, drawing from his work. But no confirmation has ever emerged, just silence and the stubborn endurance of a mystery. T. Henry Moray may have found something too big for his time, or he may have built nothing at all. But the way his invention disappeared, violently, methodically, permanently, suggests someone believed he had something worth hiding. What if energy doesn't need to be generated, but simply gathered? And what if the only thing stopping us is the key we've been told not to turn? Moscow, 1992. In a drafty Russian laboratory, physicist Eugene Podkletnov leans over a spinning disk cooled to near absolute zero. Around him, instruments hum, lights flicker, and data scrolls slowly across monitors. Then he sees it. An object suspended above the disk, has lost weight. Not much, just a few percent, but measurable, repeatable. Gravity, it seems, has been weakened. He publishes a paper describing the phenomenon, a rotating superconducting disk, generating a field that partially shields gravity. If true, it's a moment that could redefine physics. If true, it would mean gravity is not a constant, but a force that can be manipulated. But almost immediately, the paper is withdrawn. Pressure comes from unknown sources. Podkletnov's research is shut down. He is forced to leave his post. Still, he files patent applications in the US, Europe, Russia. But before long, the US application is classified. The European patent is approved, but key technical details are redacted. In Russia, the government permits partial publication, then locks away the rest. In all cases, the same aspects are hidden: the precise material composition, the rotation speed, the electromagnetic field parameters, the geometry, the pieces that matter. Attempts to replicate the effect using public data yield little. Some researchers observe anomalies, but nothing consistent, nothing definitive. The public narrative settles. It didn't work. But behind the curtain, something else unfolds. In 2006, it's reported that Boeing's Phantom Works, their advanced research division, achieved similar results. They filed gravity modification patents. These too were quickly classified. The public program vanishes without explanation. NASA's Breakthrough Propulsion Physics project also explored unconventional technologies, including gravity manipulation. Their public reports hint at classified findings. Quiet acknowledgements that some effects were not fully understood. Podkletnov continues his work independently. He speaks cautiously. He avoids describing the configurations that got him in trouble, but the implication is clear. Something about his setup, his superconducting disk spinning within precise electromagnetic parameters, touched a fundamental force. Gravity, unlike other forces, has always been stubborn. It cannot be blocked, redirected, or reversed until perhaps it can. If Podkletnov's claims hold truth, even partially, the implications are enormous. Propulsion without fuel, structures that float, new architectures for space, transport, and energy, a rewrite of physics textbooks and power structures alike. But instead, his discovery sits in limbo, part myth, part classified file, dismissed publicly, investigated privately. A paradox of modern science. What cannot be discussed, yet cannot be ignored? What if gravity is not a law, but a suggestion? And what happens when someone dares to revise it? California, 1934. A soft violet beam arcs silently across a room, aimed not at steel or glass, but at life itself. Royal Raymond Rife, a microscope builder turned researcher, adjusts the dials of his beam ray device. Through careful tuning, he claims to have found the natural resonant frequencies of bacteria and viruses, and when he hits the right one, they shatter like a wine glass to a soprano's note. He shows it to doctors, demonstrates it in clinics. Patients with terminal conditions report improvements. Some claim remissions. The technology promises non-invasive treatment, no drugs, no surgeries, just frequency and light. Rife applies for patents. He is told his invention is not patentable in its full form. The key frequencies, the waveforms that destroy pathogens, are considered too dangerous, not for patients, but for weaponization. This is 1930s America, a time when the Invention Secrecy Act does not yet exist. But other forms of pressure do. His lab is vandalized, his records stolen. Collaborating doctors are threatened with license suspensions. His partners are discredited. The American Medical Association calls his device quackery. Pharmaceutical interests, threatened by the idea of frequency-based medicine, mount aggressive campaigns to erase his work from public memory. But something else happens too. Government agencies, including military and intelligence groups, begin examining Rife's technology, not for healing, but for harm. The same principle that could disrupt cancer cells could, if reversed, be used to target healthy tissue, to disable, to kill. Soon, aspects of Rife's research are retroactively classified. Frequencies vanish from public records. Waveform schematics disappear. His device is labeled pseudoscience. Rife fades into obscurity. He dies in 1971, impoverished and bitter. Decades later, hobbyists and fringe researchers build crude replicas of his beam ray. Some claim to experience results, others find nothing. The frequencies they use are guesses. The originals remain hidden, locked in classified files or lost in time. Why suppress a medical tool unless it posed a dual-use threat? Perhaps Rife's frequencies touched on something elemental, the vulnerability of life to resonance. Perhaps his invention was too early for a world unprepared to treat frequency as both scalpel and sword. Today, modern science explores similar ground: pulsed electromagnetic fields, frequency-specific microcurrents, ultrasonic therapies. The edge between healing and harm is still being mapped. But Rife's story raises deeper questions. What if life responds to vibration more deeply than we know? And what if the key to curing disease was hidden, not because it failed, but because it worked too well? Ohio, 1990, a rust-colored dune buggy rolls down a suburban street. It hums quietly, no exhaust, no fumes, no gasoline. At the wheel is Stanley Meyer, a former military draftsman turned inventor. His claim? The vehicle runs entirely on water. At the heart of Meyer's system is a water fuel cell. He says it splits water into hydrogen and oxygen using a fraction of the energy traditional electrolysis requires. The key, he explains, lies not in brute force, but in resonance, high-frequency electrical pulses that destabilize molecular bonds. Once split, the gases power a standard internal combustion engine. He demonstrates it to journalists, to investors, to engineers. The buggy drives. People watch it happen. The device is real. The explanations are not universally accepted. Scientists remain skeptical. Physics says, you can't get more energy out than you put in. The laws are clear. Meyer's device, if it works as claimed, would violate the very foundations of thermodynamics. So why did the US government classify his patent? In 1990, Meyer files his application. Soon after, he receives a secrecy order. He is prohibited from disclosing technical details, especially the resonant frequency parameters, electrode configurations, and voltage pulse characteristics, he says, make the process work. Legal threats follow. He tries to continue his work quietly. Patents are filed overseas, but funding dries up. Then, in 1998, something tragic happens. After a business meeting with foreign investors, Meyer takes a sip of cranberry juice, runs out of the restaurant, clutching his throat, and dies in the parking lot. The official cause? Cerebral aneurysm. His brother insists otherwise. Meyer's final words, he says, were, "They poisoned me." Conspiracies swirl, equipment vanishes. His workshop is cleared, the buggy is stored. The core details of his process, the specific electrical tuning he claimed unlocked water's potential, remain under classification. Researchers try to replicate the effect. Some report small anomalies. Others find nothing. Without the missing frequencies, the secret stays buried. Why would the government suppress a device that doesn't work? One theory is that Meyer's process did work, not as perpetual motion, but as a subtle manipulation of molecular dynamics. Not free energy, but energy made accessible through a deeper understanding of resonance. If so, it would threaten oil, gas, automotive industries, entire sectors of the global economy, a shift not just in energy, but in power. Another theory is more cautious. The device might not work reliably, but its principles could apply elsewhere, in weaponry, in covert energy systems, in technologies yet to be developed. Meyer died unrecognized, his dreams folded into silence. His water car remains a symbol of what might have been, or what still might be. What if the true fuel was never water, but the knowledge of how to listen to its secret song? And who decides when that song is too dangerous to hear? Springfield, Virginia, 1979. Inside a cluttered garage, surrounded by stacks of magnets and hand-drawn schematics, Howard Johnson spins a small rotor made entirely of permanent magnets. No wires, no batteries, no motors, just the careful geometry of magnetic fields. It turns. Johnson smiles. He believes he's found the secret to continuous motion, powered only by magnets. No fuel, no electricity, just force arranged in just the right way. It sounds like fantasy. Perpetual motion. A violation of physical law. And yet, in 1980, the US Patent Office grants him a patent, something it rarely does for such devices. It's a narrow approval, phrased carefully, avoiding claims of over-unity. It describes the configuration, not the implications. But that's not the full story. Johnson files additional patents, expanded versions with improvements and performance data. He claims they can generate usable power, drive generators, perform work. These applications are not approved. They are seized, classified. He receives a secrecy order. From that moment on, Johnson is forbidden to disclose the precise improvements. He cannot build new models. He cannot share his data. The system, he says, relies on subtle manipulations of field geometry that overcome the friction and magnetic cogging that stop other permanent magnet motors. Without those adjustments, replication fails. Skeptics dismiss it all. Magnets can't do work indefinitely. Eventually, energy is lost to heat, drag, and resistance. The first law of thermodynamics doesn't bend, and the devices built from Johnson's public patent, they spin briefly, then stop. But if his improved models worked as he claimed, even partially, the implications are staggering. A solid-state energy system, no combustion, no moving parts beyond the rotor, no emissions, just engineered magnetic fields, a clean, quiet motor running indefinitely. And so, the secrecy makes sense, or at least a kind of sense that emerges when physics meets geopolitics. Perhaps the device truly worked, or perhaps the magnetic configurations he discovered had applications in advanced propulsion, weaponry, or sensing systems. Field geometries that mattered in ways not fully understood. Sometimes, what matters isn't whether something works as claimed, but whether it hints at something deeper. Johnson spent the rest of his life trying to challenge the order. He argued that permanent magnets were not state secrets, that geometric arrangements shouldn't be classifiable, but courts ruled otherwise. He died in 2008. The improvements died with him. His granted patent now sits in the public domain. Anyone can build it. Many do. And yet, without the missing parameters, they all fall short. What if the motion wasn't perpetual, but the silence was? And what do we lose when discovery becomes a threat to control. 2012. A university lab somewhere in the United States submits a patent for a revolutionary energy storage device, a graphene-based supercapacitor that, if the data holds, stores as much energy as a lithium-ion battery, yet charges and discharges almost instantly, with far greater stability and lifespan. The design is deceptively simple: sheets of graphene engineered with atomic-scale defects, paired with a new dielectric material that enhances charge retention. It isn't just a scientific breakthrough, it's a practical one. It can be manufactured, scaled, deployed. 2 weeks later, the patent is classified. The lead researcher is called in, instructed to cease all related work. The lab is ordered to destroy samples. Digital records are to be deleted. The reason given: national security. The decision is not only swift, but severe. Most secrecy orders delay and review. This one obliterates. The university protests, citing academic freedom and private funding. The response is blunt. Further resistance will endanger all federal support. They comply. The researcher declines a Department of Defense contract that would have allowed continuation under strict classification. They walk away from years of work. A technology that might have changed the energy landscape is reduced to ash and memory. Why such urgency? Supercapacitors, while known, have always lagged behind batteries in energy density. This device changed that. It offered performance that could replace chemical batteries in vehicles, smartphones, power grids, everywhere. No toxic waste, no slow charging, no degradation. Imagine a world where electric cars charge in seconds, where power outages become relics, where energy is portable, stable, abundant. Then imagine what that means to entrenched industries and to militaries reliant on energy logistics. Some suspect the real reason behind the classification lies not just in the capacitor itself, but in its broader implications. Such a device would upend economic and strategic assumptions. The ability to store and discharge large amounts of power instantly could transform weapon systems, power infrastructure, surveillance equipment. More troubling still is what followed. Months after the classification, a series of patent filings emerge from private defense contractors. The designs are eerily similar, down to the defect engineering patterns in the graphene. These patents, too, are classified. The timeline suggests that either the original research was absorbed or duplicated in parallel. The researcher who made the discovery, they vanished from the academic landscape, bound by silence. Their work erased from public record, their name scrubbed from what might now be the foundation of a classified revolution in energy storage. No explosions, no controversy, just disappearance. What if the future of power arrived quietly and was quietly buried? And how many lights never turned on because of it? The world we live in is shaped not only by what is discovered, but by what is hidden. Over a century of invention has yielded astonishing breakthroughs: electricity, flight, nuclear energy, space travel. But running parallel to that progress is a quieter current, one of suppression, of knowledge filed away, not because it failed, but because it succeeded too well, or revealed something too destabilizing. From cold fusion in a tabletop beaker to gravity shielding disks in Russian laboratories, from frequency-based medicine to magnet-based motors, from engines that never overheat to power cells erased in weeks. In each case, the story follows the same arc: a breakthrough, a filing, a door quietly closing. The public told it didn't work. The inventor told not to speak. Secrecy orders exist for reasons: national security, strategic advantage, but they also erase potential. Technologies that could have rewritten our relationship to energy, propulsion, health, and even gravity, locked away without debate, without peer review, without choice. What remains are fragments, drawings passed between researchers, whispered stories at conferences, a prototype gathering dust in someone's garage. The feeling that something is missing, not in science, but in access. And the cost is profound. Thousands of inventions have been seized under the Invention Secrecy Act. Most will never see daylight. Some might be frauds. But in any field, a few percent of extraordinary claims turn out to be real. If even one of those classified devices worked, just one, it could reshape civilization. We will never know. And that's the point. When knowledge is controlled, so is the future. When ideas are silenced before they can be tested, truth becomes a matter not of evidence, but of authority. This is not a call for conspiracy. It is a call for transparency, for scientific courage, for asking not just what is possible, but who decides what is permissible. The world may not be ready for some technologies, but how will we ever be ready if we're never allowed to try? The drawer is still closed, but the questions remain. What lies beyond the inventions we never knew we lost? And what kind of future could we build if we were finally trusted to see it?